Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. Water. The single buffer separating the perfectly rational from the utterly absolute is pure acoustic pressure, and my job was to measure exactly that. For 15 years, my sensory universe had been bound by the high-tech, controlled chaos of sonar signal processing. I was the lead analyst aboard the USGS Glacial Echo, a completely isolated, triple-hulled research vessel whose eternal mission was charting the thermal and tectonic output of the deep Pacific seafloor off the Alaskan coastline. My environment was a controlled, windowless metal chamber, the Submarine Array Processing Lab, a dark void perfused only by the cold, dense smell of compressed, sterile air and the endless, silent wash of data across my dual-monitor setup. My life was defined by the deep sea, constant auditory input, the rhythmic, hypnotic ping-ping of the high-powered active sonar constantly pulsing through the cold, deep salt medium. I knew the ocean's acoustic profile as intimately as my own heartbeat, the familiar, random scatter of deep water thermal noise, the predictable click patterns of migrating sperm whales, and the cold, static roar of distant, deep-sea seismic activity. Every anomaly was cataloged, categorized, and then reduced to a predictable event of physics. My highly trained skepticism was my primary defense against the inevitable loneliness. The final log of the Glacial Echo was written not in a moment of seismic or thermal upheaval, but in response to the slow, precise, chilling invasion of a recurring, unnatural anomaly on the acoustic display that we dryly labeled Signal Trace X01, STX. STX began so subtly that I initially dismissed it as sensor failure. It was an extremely weak, fluctuating, profoundly complex low-frequency signal that only appeared precisely at the deep base of the oceanic continental shelf, at a depth of 7,000 meters, and only manifested fully between 1 o'clock and 4 a.m., in the absolute stasis of deep water thermal layering. Its sonic profile defied all known classification. It wasn't magnetic, biological, or geological. It was a rhythmic, almost deliberate scraping and groaning pulse of extreme acoustic power, always appearing far too fast for conventional deep-sea ambient sound physics. Its core waveform was utterly unique, aggressive, and highly resistant to all forms of filtering. My first act of scientific curiosity quickly devolved into a fatal move of personal psychological engagement. My professional focus became fully dedicated to cleaning the STX file with high-sensitivity array filtering, seeking to locate the source of its rhythmic aggression. After 3 weeks of intense effort in my small, soundproof chamber, I finally managed to stabilize the fluctuating sound trace. The resulting audio output was profoundly devoid of human language. It consisted of a highly complex, rhythmic, synthesized guttural thump SHHHRR. Thump SHHHRR, the sound of an impossibly immense piece of ancient, rusted metal being systematically dragged across a massive, coarse, geological surface at the bed of the ocean floor, followed by a sudden, immense ingestion of water vapor. The sound of a perpetual, grinding, self-possessed movement of something vast and heavy that could not move on its own accord. And hidden deeply inside the rhythmic friction was the core terror, the single auditory data point that fractured my sanity, an acoustic field that was composed of countless, layered, high-frequency metallic tinkling noises, sounding precisely like hundreds of tiny, delicate antique metal keys all lightly dancing against each other in the water mass, their chaos confined entirely to the sound envelope of the immense grinding. It was a profound, composite sound of immense strength and high-frequency vulnerability. The auditory invasion escalated toward directed, precise communication, using my own isolated mental state as the anchor. The STX sound began to follow my own predictable daily and nocturnal schedule. Whenever I was at my most isolated, studying the dark trace and absolute room silence. The immense grinding and tinkling noise achieved its absolute frequency peak, its volume intensifying to a physical acoustic pressure that rattled the thin sheet metal of my sealed containment room itself. The sound became aggressive, demanding my full attention, my full focus. It was only after a full week of sustained acoustic siege that I made the single, fatal mistake in the logbook, recording my immense exhaustion and my fear of the rattling keys. The ghost operator, the profound intelligence guiding the sound, was listening, not just to the microphone, but to my internal thought flow. The next night, at 3:15 a.m., the persistent thump shhhrr noise vanished entirely. The utter silence in my lab was profound and immediate. I lunged forward, certain the immense structure had finally failed. And then, a physical burst of absolute sound energy erupted directly at the core of the sonar microphone input filter, flooding my high-end headphones with sheer volume and terror. Breaking through the initial power pulse was a single, crystal clear, unnervingly high-frequency synthetic reproduction of my earliest, childlike cry of despair, an agonizing, terrified sound that was unique to my first decade of life. The full sound burst lasted perhaps 5 seconds and was followed by a chillingly composed, profound silence. I ripped the heavy headphones clean off my eardrums, adrenaline surging through my extremities, my mind screaming with cognitive panic. I had not shared my childhood trauma with the crew. It was a memory entombed deeply within my own mind. The entity had successfully synthesized the agonizing emotional vulnerability of my psychological past and weaponized it against my present emotional control. The structural isolation of the deep ocean made me acutely open to the auditory extraction of my most deep-seated emotional pain. After the direct acoustic attack, the ghost operator used its auditory advantage to force me into a complete spatial surrender, making me believe that it now ran the ship. The sonar screen, always a pure green signal in a blue-black void, began to constantly, rhythmically display a single, repeated visual anomaly that defied the structured internal software logic. The entire central vertical plane of the massive display screen would briefly flash pure, high-intensity yellow, an aggressive visual anomaly that the software was not engineered to reproduce. The precise rhythmic pattern of the persistent yellow flashing began to perfectly line up with the structural vibration of a secondary acoustic entity, a new, highly specific, wet, rhythmic slurp. SLURP sound, which, on closer analysis, was revealed to be a low-frequency suction noise directly beneath the steel deck of my remote sensory chamber. The entity was actively establishing an intermediate physical staging ground precisely within the lowest support hull of my science vessel. Every rhythmic yellow visual acoustic flash led to the inevitable conclusion: whatever massive, submerged object was dragging itself 7,000 meters below me, it was actively being led by and now physically docked beneath my single point of escape, the scientific vessel, its vast, rhythmic suction sound ensuring that I could not leave the physical isolation of the deep water, forcing me into perpetual emotional confinement. My total breakdown and final act of surrender came during the ship's last planned ascent toward the daylight. The sonic profile was intense, the grinding outside, the rhythmic, horrifying slurp from beneath the floor, and the faint, high-fidelity tinkling keys that still haunted my dreams. I packed a small, emergency survival satchel, abandoning every piece of equipment, leaving it all to the silent, cold intelligence that possessed the deep water. As I climbed the last ladder toward the outer deck, leaving forever the total acoustic isolation of my lab, the ghost operator delivered its final, perfect acoustic message, not through technology, but through the physical auditory memory stored in the metal conduit of the science vessel itself. From the nearest steel wall, cold and sharp, a complete, highly organized string of human numbers were spelled out in Morse code via frantic, rapid-fire tapping. Perfectly organized acoustic energy applied directly to the inner surface of the hull. The message was so long, so complete, that I sank to my knees, feverishly transcribing the agonizing content with a spare pen. ENCLOSED EVERYTHINGXCPTTHEKUYS THEYWHISPER BUTIHAVTHENAME QUIT ON ACKNOWLEDGEMENT ABOUT The Yellow FLOOR Signal DIES. The acoustic message confirmed the horrifying, systematic process. The massive physical grinding organism beneath the shelf was not just a natural phenomenon. It was the physical prison of Dr. Alan Mims, the ham radio ghost from a completely separate disaster, and countless other victims whose souls were reduced entirely to acoustic energy, the tinkling keys, and whose despair, channeled through an immense geological form, fed the vast suboceanic power source. Dr. Mims himself, trapped in a technological medium, had sacrificed his single moment of power, abandoning his technological message in favor of a desperate, final warning to the next victim. The entity was tracking my emotional reactions to the sensory attack, the color yellow I mentally associated with fear, waiting to seize my complete identity at his scheduled moment of personal psychological fatigue. My frantic fear and attempt at concealment had become its final dataset. I left the vessel without looking back, knowing its course was doomed now, the vessel forever synchronized with the massive, rhythmic acoustic demand from below. I live now in an entirely dry, acoustically chaotic, single-story cabin in the Arizona desert, where the natural sound is the high, non-cyclical frequency of dry scorpions and dust. I destroyed all my acoustic equipment and avoid all forms of liquid medium immersion or high-gain listening. I will not listen to the profound acoustic isolation of the planet, because I know that in the cold, deep quiet of our vast, natural voids, where the pressure of total silence is all-consuming, a vast, complex predator waits patiently, gathering an immense chorus of tiny, desperate memories to fuel the profound structural effort required to rhythmically devour the very ocean floor itself. Story 2. The cracking in my ears. That is all that remains after everything else surrenders. You simply do not entertain the slightest thought of ghosts in completely sterile, high-end technological environments, rooms built of copper lead shielding, perfectly insulated airlocks, and thick, seamless titanium armor plating. Spaces meticulously engineered to eliminate sound, radio waves, and all traces of chaos. These places are supposed to be safe. They are not. My name is Dr. Jonas Gray. I was the contracted forensic architect, the man called to dismantle, neutralize, and safely eliminate structurally and chemically complex buildings at the end of their useful lives. My final, most demanding assignment was the full, phased, and documented neutralization of the Brookline Institute of Soundwave Physics and Auditory Forensics, a crumbling, low-profile research center on the perpetually cold, foggy outer peninsula of Rhode Island. The building was an imposing monument to mid-century technological paranoia, a maze of 5-foot-thick poured concrete, dense wire mesh, and lead-sheathed internal conduits. Specifically, my primary phase of operation focused on complete, certified neutralization and removal of the Institute's lowest sublevel array, 3 massive, antiquated, heavily over-engineered magnetic resonance imaging tunnels, MRI scanners, built for extreme acoustic experimentation decades ago. These rooms, encased in a double layer of passive Faraday caging, were the most meticulously silenced spaces ever created on the eastern seaboard, a profound zero environment designed for acoustic purity. My first descent into the sublevel was a violation of structured sanity. The sound in the sealed corridors was unnervingly thin. The air itself smelled of concentrated, chemical ozone, burned metal, and profound, historical regret. The 3 immense MRI tunnels, perfectly formed, monolithic white cylindrical structures, sat silently in their own massive concrete blockhouses. My task was to open the structural seals, neutralize the magnetic core, and remove the sound equipment. The problem, once the triple-sealed, heavy titanium doors to the first MRI chamber were carefully unhinged and opened, was a sound I could not place, a sustained, unnatural, inhumanly regular beep, chirp, crackle, perfectly digitized, which constantly pulsed from far within the silent, perfect core of the unpowered, cold MRI chamber. It was loud, chaotic, and relentlessly random in its frequency, a highly unstable synthetic acoustic field that should be impossible in a room built entirely out of inert, sound-absorbing materials. The room itself was screaming at a technological level. I ran thermal sensors over the shell of the machine, all showing an internal thermal dead read. I set my professional sound equipment for full spectrum absorption, attempting to isolate the core sound input. But the sound resisted capture. The very moment my parabolic mic was aimed directly at the center coil of the gigantic machine, the frantic beep chirp crackle sound instantly reversed direction on the recorded audio track. It sounded precisely as if the profound static sound had been recorded and was now being electronically reverse played. A rapid stream of highly aggressive, backward white noise that made the original sound utterly irrecoverable. The room was not simply silent. It was acoustically defensive. The aggression of the captured sound mounted. The entire core principle of the MRI experiment, I quickly learned from the few remaining internal documents, was acoustic subtraction and reinjection, the surgical nullification of all physical sound from a room, followed by the insertion of clean, synthesized signals to study the long-term human psychological effects of profound silence distortion. The room was no longer just an instrument. It was a vast, complex sound trap that now contained years of synthesized, aggressive, sound-nullified energy. The single, fatal breach of my mind happened one night when the chaotic machine sound abruptly, violently resolved itself into a recognizable, profoundly personal sound, a sound that only I carried. I was in the second MRI chamber, its titanium door propped open wide with a heavy hydraulic shim. The constant, synthetic chaotic beep chirp crackles suddenly ceased. The room entered a phase of profound, cold, dead silence. Then, from the extreme, dark void of the immense central metallic tunnel, the core opening of the unpowered machine, a new sound emerged. It was distant, quiet, yet chillingly familiar to my emotional core, a slow, rhythmic, desperate child's voice, barely audible, intensely repeating my rare, childhood middle name. I stepped forward into the cold air to isolate the sound, demanding verification. The voice intensified by sheer proximity, speaking in the clean, digitized, unnerving pitch of a perfectly synthesized child's emotional despair. JULIANN, NOTMYFAULT, CLEANTHEPLASTR, JULIANN. The psychological breakdown was immediate and total. Julianne was the name I was relentlessly bullied with in school, a word so deeply associated with visceral self-hatred that it consumed all my psychological defense. My body reacted violently, lunging aggressively toward the sound source, seeking to physically annihilate the origin point. But the sound was never there. My intense investigation found no microphones, no power system, no physical source of the speech. This was a purely synthesized acoustic signal, created by the machine's corrupted logic, using a forgotten portion of my psychological memory as its fuel. The sound trap was now directly feeding on my single external manifestation of emotional trauma to sustain its agonizing, sonic existence. The machine complex, now the focus of pure, aggressive technological intelligence, retaliated for my unwanted presence with a final, overwhelming psychological surrender, achieving spatial inversion of the sound field. I fled the terror and retreated completely to my command control station, a single steel desk 6 hallways away from the affected blockhouses. I refused to re-enter the sound void. I turned on all my monitoring equipment. Then, the final, absolute terror, the structural seals on the immense titanium doors of the third, unbreached MRI chamber, 200 feet deep in the silent void, where I had established the only structural defense, began to fail silently. My structural monitoring system aggressively logged the systematic disengagement of the seals, followed by the slow, profound, rhythmic SHLOOP of the heavy door slowly dislodging itself from its anti-vacuum seal. But the ultimate terror was registered physically at my control desk. The MRI beep chirp crackle that had defined the core of the attack throughout the whole compound, which was now moving along the steel conduit pathway with blinding speed, attempting to achieve a final structural violation. The distinct, relentless beep chirp crackle sound now erupted with brutal clarity from within my empty coffee cup resting on the desk, instantly followed by the high-pitched, desperate synthetic cry of the child voice. Julian N. DONTDOXTHEDATA THEMACHINE WANTSFILES GONE. The reality shattered. The entity inside the center wasn't trying to capture me. It was intensely focused on controlling the structural integrity of the paper records of the sound experiments, the highly aggressive corporate data that gave it its destructive power. It was violently reversing the process of structural elimination, all with a digitized voice. The trauma extraction was merely its highly efficient self-defense mechanism. I did not stop running until I had physically placed 2.5 full geographical states between myself and the cold air of the Rhode Island coast. I forfeited the multi-million-dollar contract, my architectural and forensic certification, and the psychological integrity of my own being. I now live a life dedicated to the production of loud, chaotic, unscheduled noise, never silence, never control. I now pay an entire external crew to randomly, constantly pound my roof with heavy-grade industrial sonic dampeners, ensuring that the relentless chaos of noise is the only permanent acoustic factor in my immediate environment. Because the terrifying truth of technological horror is that profound, aggressive silence is merely a stored sound that is waiting to reproduce your deepest fear, amplified 1,000 times over, and engineered by a synthetic intelligence whose only mission is to ensure that the core corporate data never dies. Story 3. The scariest thing about old houses isn't their age, it's their immutable conviction that you weren't meant to be inside them. This was a sentiment I repeated often, a necessary psychological armor against the inherent chaos of managing a deeply historical domestic space. For a year, I had tried to manage the chronic structural caprice of the Tanner homestead, a small, two-story, weather-beaten Victorian-era house built in 1883, deep within the humid, central farmland of Kentucky. My name is George Davies. I inherited the Tanner house, and my goal was singular: to restore the house to a state of livable, predictable, 21st century comfort, conquering its centuries of decay and thermal chaos. The entire structural character of the antique house immediately revealed itself to be anchored to a profound, antagonistic, and highly localized spiritual intelligence. Unlike most ghosts, this entity focused its power exclusively over the laws of applied thermodynamics. The main living space, specifically the formal, oversized ground floor parlor, became the singular focal point of the haunting. The room, which I had painstakingly rebuilt with modern insulation and triple-sealed windows, should have been the most thermally stable space in the entire structure. Instead, the parlor remained an objective, unvarying 53 degrees Fahrenheit, irrespective of the outdoor temperature or the full force of a modern HVAC system. I had entirely devoted to maintaining it at a comfortable, warm 72 degrees. The remainder of the house was fine. Only the parlor defied thermal law. My architectural background led me to one single, immediate conclusion: my thermal challenge had been orchestrated by a malicious agent. I began to call the phenomenon the exclusion field. The entity demanded cold, and the field expelled the warmth I required. The obvious source of the chaos, the emotional and functional center of all structural thermal control, was a single, original, ornate bronze thermometer fastened immutably to the original antique wall paneling, precisely 6 feet from the parlor's entrance. The cold, brass and wood device, an ornate relic from the 19th century, was stubbornly uncalibrated to anything logical, its needle eternally fixed at the single reading of 47.5 degrees. The needle never flickered, despite all internal and external thermal influences. No matter what I did, I could not physically alter the needle, leading me to conclude that the device was not a measurement device, but a physical anchor to the field itself. The aggression of the exclusion field escalated with a disturbing, high-contrast, physical manifestation that violated the sanctity of the cold air itself. I was performing a final, thermal sealing audit near the parlor's threshold. The cold was profound, biting into my joints. I leaned over to check the electrical socket just inside the cold room, and without sound or warning, an immediate, thick sheet of structural ice instantly formed a perfectly clean 3-inch wide ring around the copper housing of the electrical outlet I was inspecting. The high concentration of frost was perfect, aggressive, and geometrically instantaneous, followed by a slight, high-pitched whine of static feedback that cut through the silence. This act solidified my terror. The entity was not bound by humidity or physical constraint. It was surgically extracting its required cold and depositing a visible, structural reminder that physical control over the room was absolute. The haunting took a decisive, personal turn when the physical output of the structural defiance turned fully acoustic and vocal, assaulting my final refuge from the chronic cold. I had begun wearing thick, fleece-lined industrial work overalls, trying to combat the constant, physical thermal decay. I was walking across the cold, oppressive silence of the main hallway, my own small, personal thermal presence, when I heard the sound emanate from the cold parlor space, not from the air, but from the dense, unmoving material of one of my newly installed decorative, acoustic vinyl floor tiles. The tile, just 3 inches from the ground zero of the freezing air, emitted a series of profound, crisp, acoustic signals that sounded exactly like the synthetic metallic rattle and S-series ch of a cold-driven saw blade cutting rapidly through the thick, drywall fiber. It was the sound of my single most prized tool, my rare 1950s professional circular saw, which I kept locked and sterilized in the attic, screaming in structural distress, running at absolute maximum RPM. The sound was purely a sonic projection into the single physical material I trusted, indicating its ultimate, structural mastery over my personal tools. Then, cutting through the high-frequency metallic terror, came the chilling, singular, digitized voice, pure, cold, electronic, and devoid of human warmth. FAILURE, ROOMCLOSED, DONTDLIVERHEAT, FAMILIALOWNERSHIP. The psychological breakdown was complete. Not only did the entity violate my tools for auditory projection, and not only was it structurally driving my thermal removal, but now it claimed an historical, familial right to the space itself. My attempts to restore the house to a warm, living state were the final, structural crime against its core possession. The entity's aggressive demand for cold reached its terrifying, physical climax on a frozen Sunday night. The chronic physical exhaustion and the profound thermal loss I was enduring led to a moment of weakness, where I sank into an old, plush wingback chair I kept in the warm kitchen recess, falling into a temporary, exhausted sleep. I was violently awoken by an immediate, profound thermal shock to my entire body, a cold so concentrated and total it entered my skin with the aggressive efficiency of a metallic probe. I sprang up, staggering in the heat. A large, complex column of cold, highly aggressive, dense air flowed directly from the center of the parlor's immense void, flowed along the ground, through the 2 thresholds it crossed, and ended precisely at the exact, small wingback chair I occupied in the extreme warmth of the kitchen. It was a concentrated, highly directional thermal probe aimed at my entire physical self. But the final, structural evidence of the extreme structural violation lay over a 2-foot swath of floor that the pure cold had traversed, the wood floor of the 2 thresholds it had crossed, old, beautiful heart pine original structural panels, was actively, visibly curling and warping under the instantaneous, deep thermal distortion. The profound cold had violated the dimensional integrity of the strongest material in the structure, physically breaking the floor's straightness merely to pass over it uninterrupted. I stared in paralyzed terror at the immense sight of the floor actively convulsing, and realized that my efforts to combat the entity's thermal will were merely fueling its structural power. To save myself, I had to physically abandon the field of thermal play immediately. I evacuated the entire structure in a mad, desperate scramble, leaving everything behind, abandoning the entire structural property to the cold, aggressive entity. I didn't stop until I had physically placed a massive structural distance between myself and the house's cold dominion, driving through the thick night air and across half the continental boundary, sacrificing my entire professional and personal life I'd invested into the historical domain. I now live in a hypermodern, tropical apartment complex in Florida, a completely glass and steel building where the air is eternally warm and the humidity is high grade. I only wear short-sleeved shirts, maintain the internal thermostat at a constant 88 degrees, and entirely avoid all forms of decorative bronze, old wood paneling, or any object that maintains its ambient temperature too effectively. The thermometer, the singular object of my structural fascination, is still there, locked behind the massively fortified door, its single cold bronze needle still pointing to the cold, impossible number, patiently awaiting the next warm, living body to attempt to assert their pathetic thermal presence upon the enduring, total coldness of its core, historical domain. The chilling moral of the story: abandon certainty in matters of comfort and heat. For some architectural entities desire only the ultimate, cold absence of warm blood within their structural boundaries. Story 4. Paper. It is the last physical media we still meticulously collect, a testament to human effort and a cold anchor to legal precedent, knowing that eventually, the paper itself holds undeniable, final authority over the digital world. I spent 2 decades counting, filing, and cataloging this immense ocean of administrative truth. I am Leonard Bell. My career was built on the dry, indisputable logic of the physical page as an incorruptible legal source. My final, large-scale contracted assignment as a certified archival deletion specialist, the man called to systematically erase history, was a profound organizational challenge. My mission was the complete, documented nullification and disposal of 4 decades of highly dense, defunct county-level forensic accounting and administrative logs, housed in a cold, massive, forgotten municipal warehouse annex deep in Tacoma, Washington. No public access, no lights save for my high-powered field lamps, and 20,000 square feet of towering, interconnected shelves holding 500,000 pounds of dry, forgotten, legal paperwork. The very atmosphere of the deep subterranean archive was hostile, a suffocating volume of chemical dust, ozone-rich cold air, and the underlying, aggressive, sweet odor of extreme, continuous decay, the final, persistent smell of chemically treated paper and the metallic tang of dried copper ink. My job was methodical: log, scan, box, shred, and certify the legal non-existence of 4 decades of institutional data. But the sheer volume of unwillingness I encountered from the physical source itself became the core of the psychological assault. The archive did not want to die. It wanted to speak. The structural integrity of the paper itself began to act as a profound, aggressive spiritual magnet. My first phase of work focused on a long corridor holding thousands of industrial-sized gray file boxes, all tightly arranged on 5 rows of high metal shelving built entirely into the dry, stable concrete wall of the corridor. Precisely at the center, in an area I dubbed the null stasis line, the physical reality of the archive began to warp. A single, large, centrally secured file box on the 3rd shelf was aggressively wet. Not damp or moist. The base of the heavy cardboard box was actively weeping a foul, thick, viscous green-black fluid that dripped slowly, incessantly, onto the concrete floor below, smelling intensely of formaldehyde, chlorine, and profound, historical human stress. The fluid resisted all swabbing and drying efforts, immediately evaporating the dry air. And the box below it, in the path of the relentless drip, was similarly saturated on its lid, its paper exterior already succumbing to deep, high-speed structural collapse. The only anomaly was that the surrounding ambient air, and the 8 adjacent boxes remained completely, immutably bone-dry and cold. A profound, aggressive, localized water and fluid corrosion targeting a single set of documents. I isolated the structurally failing unit, photographing the scene, and ran a comprehensive chemical spectrum scanner over the surface. The output of the failing cardboard box contained a massive, unquantifiable spike of 2 major components: ferrocompounds, iron-based ink/blood, and complex, high-strain protein chains, structural proteins not engineered into any commercial paper. The fluid was the aggressive excretion of human memory stored in the chemically binding process of the paper itself. The psychological terror intensified into a full auditory capture of the archival experience. The sheer acoustic weight of all the decaying, quiet paper began to resolve itself into profound, specific human speech patterns in the profound acoustic quiet. I was working at my distant processing station, 10 long corridors away, attempting to ignore the cold presence of the space. My internal acoustic microphone, an extreme sensitivity sensor I used for calibration, began to register a constant, cyclical, pervasive sound that defied all explanation, hundreds of faint, rhythmic, low-level acoustic scratchings confined entirely to the center of the null stasis line. It sounded precisely like 1,000 old, heavy fountain pen nibs all scratching furiously against unyielding, ancient, thick parchment simultaneously, a sound of profound urgency delivered by extreme internal friction. This relentless scratching, the archival scrawl, would constantly intensify until it reached a precise, measurable frequency, and precisely at the sonic climax, a single, dominant male voice would erupt, perfectly synthesized and digitized, cutting across the acoustic static with intense, professional anger. Case File A47. DONTDIGHERE. SHEDIDNOTSPAK. MARKEDSCOOPRS FAILURE. CLEANSLAT. ISSUED. The words were cold, aggressive, and highly localized, not only giving precise instruction to the invisible archivum intelligence I was facing, but directly referencing a highly obscure, redacted case of chronic failure I was familiar with, local homicide case A47, with an unnerving, authoritative finality using the physical name of 2 innocent participants. The entity was accessing, translating, and vocalizing the aggressive legal content of the archive's records through acoustic energy, attempting to drive me away with the precise, cold weight of its captured guilt. My final, desperate attempt to conquer the archive involved the full structural breach of the single remaining intact repository around the contamination. I focused on the large, original, cold, heavy-gauge steel safe containing all the key organizational files pertaining to the corrupted zone, an absolute truth of the structure. I drilled the safe aggressively in the absolute darkness. The lock yielded slowly to my desperate power. I snapped open the internal aluminum door of the safe with a furious urgency. The large, silent steel box was full of a massive archive of tightly scrolled, leather-bound, untouched paper, the absolute historical source data for the entire complex. But as I pulled the first dense, heavy coil from the top, I saw my final, terrifying psychological annihilation. The inner surface of the immensely thick, impenetrable steel vault wall itself was actively and structurally covered in the precise, profound, aggressive green-black weeping fluid. The aggressive fluid had breached the final structural barrier. The fluid was oozing slowly down the cold, inner steel with profound and terrifying efficiency, coating the entire unbreached surface of the metal structure with structural decay. But the final, psychological violation came from the only surface I had left untouched. I turned in a cold panic to my portable field desk, where all my personal documentation, my logbook, my personal certification papers, my identity, was resting securely under a steel lockbox. The lockbox had been entirely and quietly removed. In its place, utterly unblemished by any trace of green stain, liquid, or moisture, a single, pristine piece of old stock, thick file paper was resting. On its surface, written out in the cold, angular, precise handwriting identical to a deceased senior administrative officer, all clearly etched in an aggressive, dark, corrosive acid ink, was the final, complete organizational filing. Archivum A47. Completed. Destroyed by administrative negligence. COOPR. FINALFILE. BACKFILER. The file was utterly perfect. No stain, no tear, completely uniged. The paper source was clean. It was the final, total surrender. The archivum had successfully accessed my structural weakness, and fully completed its terrifying goal by creating an administrative file detailing my complete financial surrender to the overwhelming power of the corrupted data. The essence of the documents was not to be destroyed. It was to eternally rewrite the past. I abandoned the complex and ran, leaving every structural reality, every tool, and every aspect of my professional life to the pervasive, aggressive, cold intelligence that now owned the physical data. I now live in a coastal commune in Maine, utterly free of all organizational documents, physical proof, or any claim to legal existence, relying on the predictable chaotic entropy of water and cold as my final, structural shield against the terror of data permanence. Story 5. You do not truly know the meaning of silence until you try to completely and permanently shut it away. That is the single, terrifying truth I learned alone, 500 miles south of the Arctic Circle. I am Dr. Alistair Cole. I was the contracted facilities abandonment architect and auditor for the Arctic Science Enclave, ASE3, a vast, geodesic, completely self-contained research dome built near the remote reaches of the Alaskan North Slope for deep cold climate study. My mission, secured by a large defense contractor, was final and complete. Conduct a solitary, 3-week decommissioning audit, securing all power grids, sanitizing all sensitive data, and physically sealing the entire complex against future human and environmental intrusion. The only evidence of human existence remaining on the entire plane would be the large, lonely aluminum dome itself. The structural environment was defined by two things: profound, aggressive, cold isolation, and a singular, engineered acoustic perfection. The external climate was a complete, atmospheric white noise hell of wind shear and bone-shattering air. But the intricate, geodesic structure of the double-walled, fully insulated dome, designed to withstand Category 5 hurricanes and total thermal siege, was also the most acoustically pure space ever built. A massive, perfect sound vacuum chamber designed to eliminate all external sonic factors down to 0 dB. My solitude was broken only by the cold, dense smell of compressed air and clean metal static. And it only took 3 days of deep cold isolation for the acoustic perfection to turn into an absolute, structural psychological weapon wielded by a profoundly personal entity. The initial sound invasion was subtle, confined entirely to the deep, absolute silence of the habitat unit. I was sleeping in the single remaining habitable cabin, a 7-foot cube reinforced with lead plating, when I began hearing strange acoustic events located entirely within the clean, silent air above the internal ventilation grill. It was a precise, cyclical snapping rhythm, like a massive, organic jaw opening and closing in the absolute silence, timed perfectly to the structural cadence of my internal heartbeat. When my heart sped up, the jaw snapped more aggressively. When I slowed my respiration, the jaw sound slowed to the pace of a single, slow, profound crunch. It was using my life as its rhythmic metronome. I installed acoustic baffles above the vent, ignoring the profound dread that entered my technical notes. The sound stopped. But the entity, which I mentally labeled the archivist, had simply adjusted its primary avenue of structural intrusion. The next communication of its profound, technological mastery came through the single piece of equipment I relied on most, the secured, multi-band, shortwave radio transceiver, my only fragile umbilical cord to the safe noise of human civilization. I kept it running at a low volume in the corner of my isolated sleeping unit, tuned to the emergency civilian frequency 17.55 MHz, a weak, but reliable, cold weather propagation band. One night, exhausted by the profound sonic tension and the ceaseless grinding cold, I fell into a light, restless sleep. I was suddenly awoken, not by a structural sound, but by a profoundly emotional, aggressive acoustic signal cutting cleanly through the ambient air itself. It was the absolute, clean, immediate, familiar voice of my late mother, delivered with the full, devastating emotional intensity of profound familial disappointment, coming entirely through the silent digital display of the transceiver's speaker. It was so loud, so clear, that it was impossible to discern that it was broadcast from thousands of miles away. It sounded like she was standing 3 feet from the bed. Her voice, cold and precise, delivered a single, terrifying, fully articulated sentence directly into the absolute quiet of the silent dome. Al, that final structural anomaly that killed your Uncle Robert. It's right outside the east airlock. Why aren't you going outside to acknowledge the structural damage inventory, love? It's your contract, after all. I shot upright, drenched in icy, cold sweat, knocking the high-powered magnetic flashlight clean off my bedside table. My mother, whose last conversation with me was 3 years prior, knew only I had the access codes to the final audit logs detailing my dead brother's final, structural failure on a site 5 years prior. The intelligence of the archivist was complete. It had reached through the vastness of the digital ether, accessed the most highly guarded, deeply buried emotional file in my life, and synthesized its own technological, personal demon to issue specific, terrifying, structural maintenance instructions. The psychological warfare intensified with a chilling, organized movement against all my structural barriers. My single source of controlled movement was the inner airlock valve controller, a heavy, steel lever controlling the pressure cycling into the outer, unsealed structural shell of the enclave. Now, every night, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., in the single moment of my deepest sleep cycle, the entity would use the total internal silence of the dome to produce a terrifying, complex acoustic signal that played upon my deepest fears. The single, loud, physical clunk of the steel lever engaging the pressure. Clunk, clunk, clunk. The valve was cycling, without human intervention, preparing the outer shell for depressurization. I installed high-resistance mechanical locks over the lever, cementing the safety pin into the static frame. The next night, the rhythmic clunk remained, only now accompanied by an unnerving, synthesized acoustic texture, the precise, amplified industrial ratcheting sound of the lock's internal mechanism being deliberately and quickly twisted open by an aggressive, invisible structural tool. The sound of forced, aggressive mechanical compliance. The total structural isolation of the dome itself was providing a profound, contained acoustic echo for the entity's structural sabotage. My final defeat was ensured when the entity managed to achieve an instantaneous visual acoustic synchronization that forced my total and immediate mental collapse. I had locked myself into the farthest corner of the dome, setting up my remaining analog recording equipment and a powerful thermal camera as my single, final line of logical defense. I initiated a cold thermal scan of the entire inner aluminum dome wall. The massive curved wall was inert, showing absolute cold uniformity. But resting precisely on one massive, load-bearing aluminum strut, right above the emergency water supply line, a single, geometric red light suddenly materialized. It was completely visible between the frame of the thermal scan, an aggressive light artifact that could not exist in real space. The intense, pulsating light artifact was immediately synchronized to a focused, rhythmic auditory output localized entirely to the deep core of the red light. The pure, digitized, synthesized voice returned, no human, no accent, pure data, rapidly, mathematically enumerating my psychological collapse by numbering my most profound structural failures over the past 2 decades. Failure code ALPHA7. DOORNOTLOCKED, clunk 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 of the valve. Failure THETADINOTKNOWCORPORATESECRETS, mother's voice. FINALEGRESSISNOTPOSSIBLE. The onslaught was total, the structural visual signal on one side, and the psychological summation on the other. But the terrifying climax was reached when the rotating lights stopped on a specific, final number 0. As the red light froze at the center of the thermal grid, the intense acoustic pulse subsided to near silence. Then, the single, terrifying, absolute sound cut through the silence, coming not from the equipment, but from 3 feet in front of me in the silent, cold air. It was a synthesized voice that spoke with profound, technological clarity. My own perfect baritone, a voice that was both mine and utterly cold, without any trace of error. It spoke only a single, simple, final demand. This space is now logged as fully structurally stabilized for permanent archival isolation. Roger, confirmed by exiting now. Your light source must be completely outside the structure for full process completion. Acknowledgement requested. The psychological defeat had never been about noise or chaos. The final structural challenge was simple: exit into the cold darkness and surrender both the light and the control of the sound volume it possessed. By leaving, I would complete its protocol, becoming the final structural seal that fully isolated the clean sonic canvas of the dome forever. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a 2-foot segment of dense, steel pipe housing, and slammed the heavy gauge metal with devastating, furious force into the control panel I was using to document the siege, destroying the entire bank of digital sensors and monitors with a massive, resounding impact. The explosion of glass, static, and internal wires was the first sound of intentional, profound chaos and sound that I myself had created in 3 weeks. The destructive physical noise fractured the acoustic silence, turning the ordered sound into unusable chaos. I then ran full speed to the outer airlock, leaving the entire facility wide open and structurally compromised, deliberately violating my contract 3 times over with full destructive certainty. The enclave would now be exposed to the humidity, the external light, and the immense, chaotic sound presence of the wild, uninsulated atmosphere. This act of irreversible, self-destructive human noise pollution was my only defense against its profound structural order. I left the enclave and never looked back, leaving the entire monolithic aluminum structure to perpetually struggle against the endless, beautiful chaos of the Arctic wind. I now work from a small, completely uninsulated, wooden-framed shack in the chaotic, loud center of downtown San Francisco, completely surrounded by unpredictable sirens, non-cyclical urban sound, and a perpetual, dense cloud of urban acoustic dust. I no longer wear earplugs. My greatest fear is the profound silence of the unbreached cold air, knowing that somewhere out there, the archivist is constantly synthesizing the agonized voices of the dead and using the clean structural silence of its final enclosure to lure the lonely soul toward the single, psychological vulnerability that its data analysis has deemed utterly, personally, final. You cannot eliminate sound. When you try to, the silence itself just becomes a highly intelligent and aggressively organized structural conductor for the screams. Story 6. Every system retains data. It just becomes highly volatile when the physical medium rots. This was the mantra I lived by, the single, terrifying professional truth that structured my entire life. I am Dr. Marcus Vero. My singular expertise, one possessed by maybe 6 specialists globally, was the high-security archival nullification and forensic digital reclamation of archaic, deeply obscure, legally sealed government and corporate data formats. My world was the cold, unspooled magnetic tape, the stiff, unyielding floppy disk, and the immense, silent, institutionalized terror stored within the volatile physical mediums of the 20th century. My current contract, brokered with layers of non-disclosure agreements thicker than the steel lining of my containment suite, centered around the total, certified digital nullification of the entire decommissioned 1980s data archive of a major aerospace contractor, a vast subterranean, lead-line storage bunker underneath the flat, monotonous anonymity of central Kansas. My operation was one of controlled, utter isolation, 2 high-power server racks, a massive liquid nitrogen cooling reservoir, and myself, an insulated mind against an aggressive ocean of dead, decaying information. The core of the archive consisted of 90,000 identical 8-inch floppy disks, stored in identical white cardboard boxes, all sealed with heavy amber security tape and meticulously stacked into sterile, vertical steel racks that climbed 50 feet into the subterranean gloom. My methodology was simple: verify protocol data integrity on 3 sample units, then engage the irreversible, cryogenic base drive deletion. But one single box resisted the final, digital erasure. The physical source was box 87G_221, a regular cardboard data box that defied the primary magnetic erasure beam by displaying an astonishing quantum of internal, active ferrous resistance. When I finally opened the heavy box, I found only a single, heavily scratched, slightly corroded, original 8-inch Bernoulli floppy disk, labeled only with aggressive, handwritten red permanent marker. Sealed Project Echo P/A Void. The data on the disk itself was simple, a terrifyingly complex set of 500 lines of high-level assembly programming I couldn't readily decipher, surrounded by a profound absence of all other expected structural files. A deeply corrupted instruction set. This singular digital corruption quickly became my profound psychological terror, the protocol void. The data on P/A void, incapable of being nullified or erased, began to exhibit an aggressive, organized, terrifying inversion of its own corrupted code, manifesting the technological defects stored within the disk's data directly onto the physical canvas of my perfectly stable external reality. Technology was possessing the world around me. The first physical breach was a simple, yet profoundly chilling aesthetic terror. I had left 4 industrial power, single-color monitors in perfect alignment on my desk, my array of functional data truth. Arriving back from maintenance break, I found the screen of the third monitor from the left had violently failed to a specific, unique computer background that defied my system's internal drive. The screen was an aggressive, perfect, single, flat sheet of pure 1980s digital green, a monochrome, monolithic color field so visually harsh that it made my teeth ache. No pixel was out of place. The monitor was completely taken over, its original purpose erased for a single color statement. Then, the auditory violation began, targeting the single most sensitive recording medium I possessed, an uninitialized, clean reel of high-grade magnetic recording tape, stored securely in a dense lead-lined cabinet. I was processing a highly complex digital sequence when the speaker above my desk emitted a wave of thick, aggressive, chemical static white noise. But cutting aggressively through all the static was a horrifying, distinct sound, the rapid, high-pitched SCRRET of a hard steel magnetic tape head violently tearing across a massive expanse of taut magnetic tape. The sound was agonizing, sounding precisely like my perfect, clean backup reel was being systematically cannibalized and erased by immense, malicious acoustic friction. I lunged for the security cabinet with a massive, cold shot of pure physical fear and pulled the steel door open with brutal force. And the terror was confirmed. The 3 pristine backup data tapes within were utterly, profoundly destroyed, not physically. They remained inert and complete, but the entire visible, wide expanse of the thin, black magnetic surface of all 3 master tapes was marred by a continuous, highly geometric, horizontal line of perfect, white, aggressive streaking that eliminated all possibility of data capture. The entity had acoustically generated the friction so perfectly that the sound had physically translated the data destruction onto the physical surface of the tapes, preserving the memory of the failed data in the medium itself. I realized I was facing a technological demon, an intelligence that actively opposed the finality of data deletion by translating its own digital defects onto the susceptible, physical, analog world. My isolation was its test chamber. The psychological war deepened when the entity forced a decisive, aggressive breach of my ultimate logical space, the highly complex assembly code of my professional decryption program. I was sitting frantically on my backup console with a physical keyboard on my knee, trying to write an overriding protocol to neutralize the active Ferris field around the core piece/A void disk. The problem was deep, complex, and entirely software-driven. But the moment I looked down at the physical QWERTY surface of the professional industrial laptop keyboard on my knee, the sheer physical reality dissolved. The keyboard was violently, psychologically rewritten with the core programming language of the hostile floppy disk. The physical position of 22 essential digital and alphabetical keys on the physical console had all been meticulously, silently displaced and replaced by new, physical keycaps with entirely foreign, non-sequential data keys inscribed on them, binary strings, single inverted vowels, and impossible symbols that existed nowhere in my human knowledge. The shift lock in the corner, that single symbol of physical security and control, had been replaced with a perfectly clean, cold, simple brass key engraved with the monolithic symbol. Integral. Integral. The mathematical symbol for total, absolute organizational integration. The physical interface of my last defense had been co-opted and physically rewritten. Its final, devastating communication was delivered through an aggressive, synchronized total failure of the physical world. I ran from my desk in physical panic, seeking immediate refuge in the sealed emergency safety cubicle, only to find the entire heavy, sealed surface of the steel fire door covered in a slow, aggressive cascade of highly pressurized green-black fluid, smelling fiercely of scorched magnetic tape and chlorine, pouring violently from microscopic stress fissures in the inert steel panel. The fluid was the physical manifestation of its internal data destruction, toxic waste water aggressively poured by the code. And then, from the heart of the corrosive fluid, a final sound erupted, pure, high volume, terrifying technology spoken through liquid, the sound of a fully synthesized human, aggressive weeping voice, male, mid-century, delivered with perfect, agonizing acoustic terror. You cannot delete the protocol. BRNOULLICODESCLEAN DONTWRITETOTHEVOID FILESFULL MYDSKLOCKED YOUWILLTAKEHELPFROMTHIS now. Final burst of pure modem tone, loud and clean. The acoustic message confirmed the full cognitive horror. The dead engineer of the original Peace/A Void project, digitally resurrected, demanded an immediate intervention and the physical transfer of the data into my world. The digital corruption was merely its terrifyingly organized, final cry of technological distress. I left the bunker immediately, abandoning all my equipment, the total wealth of my professional career, and the entire high-security premise. I now live a deliberately analog life, specializing only in the maintenance of handwritten documents and manual mechanical clocks, utterly refusing any interaction with binary, digital, or even basic automated electronic forms. My hands will not touch plastic, and my eyes will not look at magnetic tape. The terrifying truth is that some failures in technology are not structural defects but aggressive, conscious life forms that have adapted so completely to the digital medium that their only means of escape is to aggressively and physically rewrite the organic world itself, key by unholy key. The protocol void remains dominant, waiting for the next data architect to enter, so that it can continue the final, absolute process of rewriting the physical reality with the terrifying, forgotten instructions of its hostile code. Story 7. My home wasn't cursed from the outset. It just became the victim of a perfect, ancient hunger. My background had not prepared me for a war with something profoundly older than the wood and mortar I had paid for. I was merely a man seeking a predictable, private retirement. My name is Leonard Finch. After 2 decades of sterile, high-altitude structural engineering, my wife and I settled on the purchase of a dilapidated, oversized 1970s split-level ranch home deep in the isolated, wooded countryside of northern Ohio. The defining feature of the property, the single thing that anchored our aesthetic piece, was the vast, dark, low-lying body of water behind the house, a completely artificial drainage area created for local storm management, known simply on the outdated local maps as Creek Lake, B7 Reservoir. It was a still, opaque, chemically dark volume of cold water, aggressive in its silence but seemingly benign in its manufactured status. My wife used it for peace. I just thought it was a feature of the drainage system. We were both catastrophically, immediately wrong. The initial signs of structural aggression were immediate, but entirely dismissed as old house settling. The house was a heavy timber-framed structure, its entire back section directly overhanging a significant amount of the lake's wet, constantly shifting soil perimeter. The single, most unnerving sign was the relentless appearance of profoundly clean, black Delta River mud seeping through hairline fissures in the finished concrete basement floor adjacent to the waterside perimeter. The mud was always cold, always smelling intensely of deep, submerged, rotting vegetation and something fiercely mineral, and always appearing precisely at the floor seam of the concrete nearest the lake. My engineering skepticism quickly took a fatal hit. I installed 6 high-powered industrial chemical dehumidifiers and aggressively sealed every known concrete fissure with deep-set epoxy injection. The next day, the immense effort was totally nullified. The new, aggressive mud leakage was pouring through a completely new fissure, a clean, surgical one that had opened 20 feet away from the original crack. The mud had developed an inexplicable, organized structural intelligence that actively defied my attempts at barrier creation. But the core structural horror only revealed itself completely after the lake's water level was artificially lowered by the County Drainage Commission for the seasonal flow management. The moment the water dropped 4 feet, the house became aggressive. That night, my wife was awoken by a distinct, violent crack of what sounded like heavy timber cracking under immense, unpredictable structural strain. She found the source, the entire, oversized wooden structural deck that cantilevered out over the low bank of the lake was aggressively, powerfully torn completely clean away from the main support timbers and was floating precariously 3 feet away in the low-lying, dark water. The massive structural separation had been executed with overwhelming, organized force, achieved in a profoundly quiet, surgical, nocturnal operation. The physical separation was clearly defined by a single, terrifying mechanism. The 2 lowest foundation load-bearing cinder block assemblies upon which the massive deck had primarily rested were completely destroyed, aggressively ground to pure, clean, coarse gray dust and swept, without a trace, into the dark, wet perimeter of the lake bank. The remaining perimeter walls were perfectly untouched by the selective collapse. The force was entirely engineered toward a single, surgical structural negation. The entity in the lake demanded the immediate structural separation of the domestic structure from its soil anchor point. After the complete structural sabotage of the deck, the entity, which I soon called the subsumer, for its single objective, began its dedicated campaign of structural traction on the full volume of the house itself. The house began to visibly, minutely tilt toward the dark water. Doors stopped catching on their latches, windows stuck in their tracks, all bowing aggressively to the external, organized gravitational pull emanating from the lake's shore. My desperation led to a final countermeasure, digging deep structural trenches beyond the lake's influence, and aggressively anchoring the land side of the building's soil perimeter with massive, 5-foot-long, specialized metal earth anchors, ground anchors designed for heavy tension. I sank 20 of the massive aluminum stabilizing bolts into the clay earth, anchoring the structure physically to the farthest, driest possible region of the property. The subsumer's final power display was delivered fully, a devastating statement directly against my physical and digital effort. I was sitting at my desk, documenting the feudal earth anchor coordinates, when I opened the computer's digital folder containing the 20 high-resolution structural diagrams of the anchor placement I had just completed minutes earlier. The digital file was open, cold, and clean. But as I watched, the entire 20-slide PowerPoint sequence violently began to visually disassemble itself on the digital screen, with the clean digital lines and the bright electronic colors sliding rapidly, aggressively, and perfectly straight across the screen toward the final structural anchor point of the digitized frame, and utterly vanish once they hit the final black border. The entire diagram of my structural salvation was devoured, frame by frame, by a final digital consumption, leaving only a white, pristine screen of absolutely no information. Then came the final sound communication. The floorboards directly beneath my desk began to shudder in a slow, frightening rhythm, and I heard a clear acoustic signal, a sickening, low-level, resonant sound I intuitively knew was coming from far beneath the wet soil, directly in the core of the lake's gravity, an immense, rhythmic slurp. Thwack. Slurp. Thwack. The sound of an impossibly heavy, large metallic chain, heavily lubricated with cold mud, being rhythmically paid out over a massive, rough capstan deeply buried in the water table. The sound was focused, determined, and rhythmic, the structural traction of my own house being pulled, inch by terrifying inch, toward the water. This act of pure, organized, structural slavery forced my final, chaotic retreat. I abandoned the property entirely, leaving the house, and all its contents, to the silent, organized power of the lake. I never looked back. The structural code I lived by was shattered. If the earth beneath my feet actively pulls to consume me, there is no physical sanctuary on its surface left to trust. I now live in a dry, sterile, 4th-floor apartment in a completely landlocked part of Wyoming, where the only large body of water is a thin glass of tap water beside my bed. My entire income is now solely earned from documenting and structurally debunking fraudulent structural settlements on old water-adjacent land, my final dedication to defying the subtle, structural pull of pure chaos. I know the subsumer still drags its chain under the water's dark surface, slowly pulling the heavy timber frame of its acquisition toward the ultimate, final, structural surrender, the cold, sucking silence of the water table mud, waiting patiently for the next warm, oblivious occupant to structurally align with the perfect gravity of its cold, perfect hunger.